Welcome to the first Headless Commerce Summit. I am super excited to be here to talk to you about why headless commerce is probably the most important thing we can talk about right now when it comes to innovation of our digital tool chain. And I'm here together with Matt Billman, my co-founder of Netlify, to talk a little bit about why is this so exciting? And of course, it all has to do with the fact that in the last few months, we've seen tremendous growth of e-commerce, as much as we've seen in the last 10 years. And that is really saying quite a lot if you think about it. And of course, this all has to do with the hundreds of thousands of cases where hundreds of points of conversions have been reduced to a single one. As physical stores are shut down and had to close out for the pandemic, the only place of conversion for so many businesses have become their e-commerce outlet. And before we get started, let's talk a little bit about what is the premise of and the inherent sort of issues and challenges of e-commerce to start with. And that is, of course, in brick and mortar, we have a possibility of creating a much more differentiated shopping experience, right? So you have smell and you have sound and you have a physical space and you can do POS and you can do all these things and you have people's time in a very different manner. However, online, it all looks a little similar, but and most importantly probably is the fact that you have such extreme transparency. You're never more than a Google search away from seeing whatever something costs somewhere else. Now, this necessarily has to lead to an inevitable outcome, which is that it becomes a game of and a category of very low margins and very high volume. So you tweak everything you can to just get into the profitability rather than the opposite. And that's sort of how you run your business. So with that in mind, it is no wonder that e-commerce managers are probably the one digital persona that has the best understanding of the value of a millisecond, right? They are so acutely aware of the benefits of increase in performance and what downtime and slow load times and bound rates, et cetera, means because it affects conversions directly, and that is their bottom line. And it really, really does matter, right? Because if you look at, for example, Google, they were talking about how improving your load time by 1/10 of a second boosts conversions rates by 8%. Another survey here by Bytes.co says that 56% of customers will abandon a website if it takes more than 3 seconds to load, and 20% of those will never return. Yet one more hammer on the nail. Amazon was out saying, and this is a while back, so it's probably a lot more today, that a second of extra load time means a loss of $1.6 billion in sales. So that's very expensive second, if you ask me. And it's not just like we're innovating our way out of this necessarily sort of in a straight line, and it gets easier and easier. In fact, if you look at, for example, 2013, about 30% of traffic came from mobile. But today, that number is actually 53%. And what mobile means is that we inherently have a twice as long time to first byte and a much, much longer fully loaded page. And people are getting increasingly impatient. That leads to higher bounce rates, right? So it is no wonder that we use so many resources in optimizing everything we can for performance. And I know that a lot of you out there will look at this less than painfully recognize a lot of these points, right? And these are not just something you do in building an e-commerce presence. No, it's something you have to do continuously to maintain it, right? And even with all this overhead and all these extra resources we throw at it, it is limited what we get out of it, right? And that is why Jamstack and headless commerce is so extremely timely and important to talk about. Simply by choosing the right stack, you'll up your conversions by 20% easier or more, right? Just by the nature of the architecture of it, right? And so for a small margin category, that is literally everything. It is the difference between success and failure for your business, right? So headless commerce done right, mind you, right? Where it takes advantage of being part of a Jamstack site makes such a difference that I think it's fair to say that today's summit, we're not here to talk about improving e-commerce. We're here talking about revolutionizing it. And so before I pass it on to Matt, who'll dive into the best practices and how the stack has evolved and why it's particularly relevant now, technologically speaking as well, what has happened for that to be the case, I want to show you just a few case studies or mentions at least to show you sort of like what you actually can get from this. So Teespring, for those of you who don't know it, is a very large t-shirt manufacturer. And individual merchants can go and design their t-shirts and they get a store where they can sell this, right? And they have more than 1 million merchants on their sites right now. So it is a very mature business. And of course, it goes without saying that when they're all about e-commerce and they're this mature, they've spent everything you can on optimizing performance. Yet they're now going away from the traditional e-commerce solution and migrating over to Netlify that builds and runs and deploys and maintains and hosts and so on your website together with a headless commerce function. And when you do that, then you have the possibility of pre-building these stores and globally distributing them. And you retain a completely different performance. But so much so that the early tests here show that, and hold on, twice the performance. They are converting twice as good as they was before. I think that's pretty amazing. I mean, we're talking 100% better conversions in the early examples. And again, this is not for someone that weren't optimizing. They were optimizing at massive scale. They had 1 million stores before. And this is actually what you get from just shifting to a new architecture and following best practices. So there really is so much. And if anyone want to dive in, we're doing a case study as well. So just ping me and I'll be sure to share that with you. Another example here is Victoria Beckham Beauty. So they have a cosmetic line that's moved, same sort of stack, moved also to Netlify. And they're now talking about how other fashion brands are even publicly benchmarking against them to understand why it's so much faster, and they feel sort of they're setting the bar for how performant something like that can be. And that's great, but I'm actually not mentioning them because of the speed here. I'm talking, they joined Netlify and they moved over as they were more than halfway into the process of renewing their web property because they saw that it didn't give them the flexibility they needed. So this approach, this decoupled approach, this headless approach also enables you to not have to implement into systems, right? You get complete control. There's no sort of saying, this is the checkout workflow. These are the constraints. No, you can't have a calendar function there. You can't do this. This is sort of, you have to work within these parameters. You can skin it, but that's the extent of it. No, here you get that fine-grained control that is completely true to the brand experience and the customer journey that they sort of want to represent on their website. And so there are a lot more benefits, especially around developer productivity, but also about this visual fidelity that you get when you choose this headless approach. And here is Matt to talk much more about it.
Thank you, Chris. So yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm here to talk a little bit about sort of the architectural changes that allows customers like Victoria Beckham or Teespring to get these kind of benefits in site performance, in flexibility, in development velocity, in the speed of experimentation, and even in the path to getting a more secure and more compliant product out into the world. And if we just start by looking at the architecture, this is really about a new architecture for the web. Like the decoupled e-commerce or the headless e-commerce is part of this general idea of decoupling the whole front-end presentation layer from your back-end and splitting the two up. It's part of this overarching Jamstack approach that we've been talking about for a while now. And if we go back and look like how did the world look like traditionally, this here is one of the architectural diagrams for running Magento in production from Magento's documentation. And for those that might not be familiar, Magento is one of the big traditional open source e-commerce platforms running with this traditional sort of monolithic application. And if you just look at this diagram, you'll see how much of the operational aspects are centered around performance, right? There's a varnish cluster for edge caching, for caching the generated HTML. There's several different web nodes. There's a whole caching layer behind that built with Redis to lighten the load on the actual database. There's then a large database cluster with replicas and so on. There's a dedicated search part of the stack on top of Elasticsearch, and then a dedicated storage layer just for images, as well as messaging queues, CDNs, proxying, all of these really complicated components just to operate at the level of performance that you'll want to get to in terms of a modern e-commerce experience. And if we look at this whole monolithic stack and check what's actually sort of inside it, like coupled inside a platform like Magento, of course you have the whole front end and the whole back end together. Like the templates live inside this monolithic system. The CSS generation, everything is like part of this. But also like if we go deeper into this backend, you'll have like the actual product catalog, right? Like the view of all the different products that we can sell, together with the detail pages of every product. Like how does it look like? How's it presented? The search, the filter, the facets that users interact with this catalog through, all defined back in this backend infrastructure. Your cart with the user state, inventory and prices are generated and managed here. Logistics and workflows are powered here. The personalization engine lives inside this larger monolithic application, and so does the checkout flow. And this really often makes every part here like sort of strongly opinionated in a way that can make it hard to really customize and really express a custom brand. So when we start really decoupling the front end and the back end, we start to be able to sort of tease these parts apart. And for the front end, like you'll see a lot of different architectural approaches. But the core part is that we have a self-standing front end that developers can work with individually, where brands that wants to really give their users a luxury experience can completely customize how it all looks like. But also where smaller projects that needs to quickly add shopping to an existing front end can pull in widgets that will power sort of the shopping cart or the checkout flow. Or we have examples of hosted flows where you build like a fully customizable product catalog, faceted search, everything, and then the actual checkout takes place somewhere else. And then the backend, you start having these different headless services. And if we look more just into some of the examples, right? Like at the front end layer, we have players like Snipcart for sort of the really, I want to quickly add a shopping cart to my experience. They'll give you the widgets, it'll come out of the box. We have players like Commerce Layer that are sort of trying to take the whole all the pieces of that, both giving you ready-made widgets, but also full APIs that you can completely customize at the front end layer, and so on. And then at the back end layer, you might have the actual products managed with a content management system like Contentful, with the full media management and media library and all the niceties of managing content that a really specialized system will give your content editors. It could be Contentful or Sanity or Cosmetic. There's like a wealth of choice there. You might have something like Stitch Lab actually managing the inventory and the logistics, and maybe run the actual payment flows through Shopify, maybe even use TakeShape to glue together Contentful and Shopify. There's a lot of options here. Algolia is a common option for faceted search and filtering and so on. They operate like a globally distributed search CDN. So even your search can come from really close to where your users are, and you can get like amazing performance. And then the pattern we see around serverless functions is to really use it as the custom layer to glue all of these different services together, where web developers actually building the front end can tailor the API calls and so on to what they're building. And we're right now seeing that about 56% of all enterprises are exploring these types of headless architectures, again, because they look to get those benefits that Chris just mentioned around performance, conversion rates, and also the developer experience. And this is really like been part of the growth of the Jamstack, and it's one of the next big exciting areas for the Jamstack to really accelerate in. One of the ideas of the Jamstack is that when you have this decoupling, you have this front end and you have this layer of APIs, we always introduce this concept of a build step where we can take things like the product catalog, take all the products from the Headless API, maybe take the prices from and inventory from our relevant Headless services, and then pre-build as much as possible and make it ready, right? Like we will see that the backend simply exposes all of our content and pricing and everything as JSON, maybe through a REST API or maybe through a GraphQL API. But everything is just exposed essentially as JSON documents. And we can then, as developers, pick any framework, any technology. It could be Next.js, it could be 11t, it could be Gatsby, it could be a pure React app or GridSum or Vue app. And we can really pick the technology that allows us to build the right user experience for the customers of the e-commerce from the ground up, with no tie-in to some big monolithic system. We run a build step and generate like static assets, pre-built product catalogs, pre-built detail pages, and we can then take those and distribute them globally, all across like a globally distributed network. And if we look just like at the contrast to the approach, right? Like the traditional server rendered Magnolia approach, it'll have like on every request that comes in, a lot of work done by the server. We'll add all these different caching layers and so on, but in reality, we'll still have like a full network transit all the way to an origin server in a specific location. And really often we'll have a lot of work done by that server and then some work done by the browser in the end. Like the other alternative is really like sort of the single page application where we have very little work done by the server, but then we have a lot of work done by the browser, right? Like we'll essentially just deliver an empty app shell to the browser, and then the browser will talk to all these different APIs and stitch together the view for the user. So we make the user's browser do a lot of hard work. And the Jamstack approach is really saying like how much of the work that's done by the server and how much of the work that's done by the browser can we take and pre-render and do in our builds. So we pre-build and give the user an incredibly fast instant experience and get a UI that's really tailored for them with a custom built front end. And of course, as Chris mentioned, one of the customers we worked with in this approach have been Victoria Beckham's beauty cosmetic line. They adopted a stack based around GridSum and Vue as the layer that allowed their developers to really just build exactly the experience they wanted to give their users. Talk to Contentful for the product catalog and so on, Shopify for the actual checkout flows, and Stitch Labs for inventory and logistics. And we talked about the performance benefits they get, but there's also just like the whole flexibility around these integrations, where before in the sort of world of a Magnolia or something like that, the checkout flows are really dictated by your platform. The way the cart behaves is dictated by your platform. And this is a place where a brand can really come in and give their users the experience that they want to choose and not what their platform chooses. The developer productivity at the layer of tooling like Vue and GridSum just gives a completely different experience than working with PHP-based templates inside a big monolithic system. You'll see that like a product list is just a simple Vue component pulling in a GraphQL query, styling within the same component, any component-specific styles, and really easy to work with in terms of development velocity. And the speed of experimentation goes up, right? Like every pull request gives a deploy preview URL where the developers can share with stakeholders. Features like Netlify's branch-based rollouts means that you can even experiment with rolling out like a change to a segment of your customers. Security and PCI, like the actual PCI compliance, is completely delegated to the actual card provider. And just in terms of distributing static assets and the Jamstack approach, you get an immense benefit to security over having a large monolithic running server. One of the last pieces I just want to touch upon here in the end is personalization. So this is one of the areas where I think there's still really interesting work to be done with headless commerce and the Jamstack infrastructure approach. And some of the things we've seen is like, you could imagine like the very simplest form of doing personalization with this stack would be to simply do a full single page application approach, right? Like you simply present an app shell and then talk to different APIs, and you build the visual UI directly for the specific user in the browser, right? Like we go back to delegating work to the browser. But another approach is to pre-render like the different variations. You still give an initial app shell, but then you fetch pre-rendered components directly from the same edge node that served the application shell, and you get like very high performance with this kind of approach. You still do a lot less work in the browser, but still have like a more single-page application-like approach. And then, of course, you have these parts that are always going to be more like a single-page application, the actual dynamic content, the shopping app, and so on. One of the things that we think will be really interesting in the future is the idea of doing even more of this personalization directly on the edge node. Like we presented at our last Jamstack conference a preview of edge handlers, which is one of the features we're building that really will allow users to take some of these patterns around personalization and get to build a personalized experience by stitching together different pre-rendered components directly in the edge node instead of doing it in the user's browser. Very excited about from where we are going with that, and extremely excited about this Headless Commerce Summit in general. This is a huge new category, and it comes with a ton of benefits to both developers and to customers and to businesses. And I couldn't be more excited for kicking off this summit. Thank you, everyone.